Okay. So, yes, we did read this, but we are rereading chapter 46. So, I am Lady Rain. This is the Reader's Nook. We are rereading chapter 46 because I accidentally deleted it. So, I do apologize if you've heard it before, but I'm sure you won't mind. It was late evening, July 27th. They were camped on what the sign, now halfway demolished by summer storms, proclaimed to be Kunkel Fairgrounds. Kunkel itself, Kunkel, Ohio, was south of them. There had been some sort of fire there, and most of Kunkel was gone. Stu said it had probably been lightning. Harold, of course, disputed that. Harold disputes everything. These days, if Stu Redmond said a fire truck was red, Harold Lauder would produce facts and figures proving that most of them those days were green. She sighed and rolled over. Couldn't sleep. She was afraid of the dream. To her left, the 5 motorcycles stood in a row, heeled over on their kickstands. Moonlight twinkled along their chrome exhaust pipes and fittings, and now I'm going to have the hiccups. Go figure. As if a band of Hell's Angels had picked this particular spot to crash for the night. Not that the Angels ever would have ridden such a pussycat bunch of bikes as these Hondas and Yamahas, she supposed. They had driven hogs. Or what was just something she had picked up from an old American international bike epics she had seen on TV? Perhaps. The Wild Angels, the Devil's Angels, Hell's Angels on wheels. The bike pictures had been very big at the drive-ins when she had been in high school. Wells Drive-In, Stanford Drive-In, South Portland Twin. You pays the money, you takes your choice. Now kaput. All the drive-ins were kaput. Not to mention the Hell's Angels and good old American international pictures. Put it in your diary, Franny, she told herself, and rolled over on her other side. Not tonight. Tonight she was going to sleep, dreams or no dreams. 20 paces from where she was lying, she could see the others, zonked out in their sleeping bags like Hell's Angels after a big beer party. The one where everybody in the picture got laid except for Peter Fonda and Nancy Sinatra. Harold, Stu, Glenn Bateman, Mark Braddock, Darian McCarthy. Take Somanex tonight and sleep. It wasn't Somanex they were on, but half a grain of Venerol apiece. It had been Stu's idea when the dreams got really bad, and they had begun to get flaky and hard to live with. He had taken Harold aside before mentioning it to the rest of them, because the way to flatter Harold was to soberly ask his opinion, and also because Harold knew things. It was good he did, but it was also rather spooky, as if they had a fifth-rate god traveling with them, more or less omniscient, but emotionally unstable and likely to fragment at any time. Harold had picked up a second gun in Albany, where they had met Mark and Perrion, and now he wore the 2 pistols crisscrossed low on his hips, like a latter-day Johnny Ringo. She felt badly for Harold, but Harold had also begun to frighten her. She had begun to wonder if Harold might not just go crackers some night and start blazing away with his 2 pistols. She often found herself remembering the day she had come upon Harold in his backyard, all his emotional defenses demolished, mowing the lawn in his bathing suit and crying. That was funny. She knew just how Stu would have put it to him, very quietly, almost conspiratorially. Harold, these dreams are a problem. I've got an idea, but I don't exactly know how to carry it out. A mild sedative, but it would have to be just the right dose. Too much and nobody would wake up if there was trouble. What do you suggest? Harold has suggested they try a whole grain of Venerol, available at any drugstore. And if that interrupted the dream cycle, they could cut back to 3/4 of a grain, and if that worked to half, Stu had gone privately to Glenn, had gotten a concurring opinion, and the experiment had been tried. At a quarter grain, the dreams had begun to creep back in. So they held the dosage at half, at least for the others. Franny accepted her drug each night, but palmed it. She didn't know if Venerol would hurt the baby or not, but she was taking no chances. They said that even aspirin could break the chromosome chain, so she suffered the dreams. Suffered. That was the right word. One of them predominated. If the others were different, they would sooner or later blend into this one. She was in her Ogunquit house, and the dark man was chasing her up and down shadowy corridors through her mother's parlor, where the clock continued to tick off seasons in a dry age. She could get away from him, she knew, if she didn't have to carry the body. It was her father's body, wrapped in a bedsheet. If she dropped it, the dark man would do something to it, perform some awful desecration on it. So she ran, knowing that he was getting closer and closer. At last, his hand would fall on her shoulder, his hot and sickening hand. She would go boneless and weak. Her father's shrouded corpse would slither out of her arms. She would turn, ready to say, "Take him. Do anything. I don't care. Just don't chase me anymore." And there he would be, dressed in some dark stuff like a hooded monk's robe. Nothing visible of his features, save his huge and happy grin. And in one hand he held the bent and twisted coat hanger. That was when the horror struck her like a padded fist, and she struggled up from sleep, her skin clammy with sweat, her heart thudding, wanting never to sleep again, because it wasn't the dead body of her father he wanted. It was the living child in her womb. She rolled over again. She didn't go to sleep soon. She really would take her diary out and write in it. She had been keeping the journal since July 5th. In a way, she was keeping it for the baby. It was an act of faith that the baby would live. She wanted it to know what it had been like, how the plague had come to a place called Ogunquit, how she and Harold had escaped, what became of them. She wanted the child to know how things had been. The moonlight was strong enough to write by, and 2 or 3 pages of diary were always enough to make her feel snoozy. Didn't say much for her literary talents, she supposed. She would give sleep one more fair chance first, though. She closed her eyes and went on thinking of Harold. The situation might have eased with the coming of Mark and Perian if the 2 of them hadn't already been committed to each other. Perian was 33, 11 years older than Mark. But in this world, such things made little difference. They had found each other, they had been looking out for each other, and they were content to stick together. Perian had confided to Franny that they were trying to make a baby. "Thank God I was on the pill and didn't have a loop," Harry said. "How in God's name would I ever have gotten it out?" Franny had almost told her about the baby she was carrying. She was over the third of the way along now, but something in her held back. She was afraid it might make a bad situation even worse. So now there were 6 of them instead of 4. Glenn refused utterly to try driving a motorcycle and always rode pillion behind Stu or Harold. But the situation hadn't changed with the addition of another woman. "What about you, Franny? What do you want?" If she had to exist in a world like this, she thought, the biological clock inside her set to go off in 6 months. She wanted someone like Stu Redmond to be her man. No, not someone like. She wanted him. There was it. That was it. There it was. Stated with complete boldness. Civilization gone. All the chrome and gewgaws had been stripped from the engine of human society. Glenn Bateman held forth on his theme often, and it always seemed to please Harold inordinately. Women's lib, Franny had decided, thinking that if she was going to be bold, I think it's supposed to be bold, She might as well go totally bald. It was nothing more or less than an outgrowth of the technological society. Women were at the mercy of their bodies. They were smaller, they tended to be weaker. A man couldn't get with child, but a woman could. Every 4-year-old knows it. And a pregnant woman is a vulnerable human being. Civilization had provided an umbrella of sanity that both sexes could stand beneath. Liberation. That one word said it all. Before civilization, with its careful and merciful system of protections, women had been slaves. Let us not gild the lily. Slaves were what they were, for any thought. Then the evil days ended, and the women's credo, which had been hung in the offices of Ms. Magazine, preferably in needlepoint, was just this. Thank you, men, for the railroads. Thank you, men, for inventing the automobile and killing the Red Indians who thought it might be nice to hold on to America for a little longer since they were here first. Thank you, men, for the hospitals, the police, the schools. Now I'd like to vote, please, and have the right to set my own course and make my own destiny. Once I was chattel, but now that is obsolete. My days of slavery must be over. I need to be a slave no more than I need to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a tiny boat with sails. Jet planes are safer and quicker than little boats with sails, and freedom makes more sense than slavery. I am not afraid of flying. Thank you, men. And what was there to say? Nothing. The rednecks could grunt about burning bras. The rectionaries could play intellectual little games. But the truth only smiles. And now all that had changed. In a matter of weeks, it had changed. How much only time would tell. But lying here in the night, she knew that she needed a man. Oh God, she badly needed a man. Nor was it all a matter of preserving herself and the baby, of looking out for number one, and she supposed number two. Stu attracted her, especially after Jess Ryder. Stu was calm, capable. Most of all, he was not what her father would have called 20 pounds of bullshit in a 10-pound bag. He was attracted to her as well. She knew that perfectly well, had known it since the first lunch together on the 4th of July in the deserted restaurant. For a moment, just one moment, their eyes had met, and there had been that instant of heat, like the power surge when all the needles swing over to overload. She guessed Stu knew how things were, too, but he was waiting on her, letting her make her decision in her own time. She had been with Harold first, therefore she was Harold's chattel. A stinking macho idea, but she was afraid this was going to be a stinking macho world again, at least for a while. If only there was someone else, someone for Harold, but there wasn't. She was afraid she could not wait long. She thought of the day Harold, in his clumsy way, had tried to make love to her, to make his claim of ownership irrevocable. How long ago? 2 weeks? It seemed longer. All the past seemed longer now. It had pulled out like warm Bonomo's Turkish taffy. Between her worry of what to do about Harold and her fears of what he might do if she did go to Stuart, and her fear of the dreams, she could never get to sleep. So thinking, she drifted off. When she woke up, it was still dark. Someone was shaking her. She muttered some protest. Her sleep had been restful and without dreams for the first time in a week, and then came reluctantly out of it, thinking it must be morning and time to get going. But why would they be get going in the dark? As she sat up, she saw that even the moon was down. It was Harold shaking her, and Harold looked scared. Harold, is something wrong? Stu was also up, she saw, and Glenn Bateman, peering, was kneeling on the far side of the place where their small fire had been. It's Mark, Harold said. He's sick. Sick? She said. And then a low moan came from the other side of the campfire's ashes, where Perian was kneeling, and the two men were standing. Granny felt dread rise up inside her like a black column. Sickness was the thing they were almost afraid of. It isn't the flu, is it, Harold? Because if Mark came down with a belated case of cat and trips, that meant any of them could. Perhaps the germ was still hanging around. Perhaps it had mutated. The better to feed on you, my dear. No, it's not the flu. Nothing like the flu. Fran, did you eat any of the canned oysters tonight? Or maybe when we stopped for lunch? She tried to think, her mind still fuzzy with sleep. Yes, I had some both times, she said. They tasted fine. I love oysters. Is it food poisoning? Is that what it is? Fran, I'm just asking. None of us know what it is. There is no doctor in the house. How do you feel? Do you feel all right? Fine, just sleepy. But she wasn't, not anymore. Another groan floated over the other side of the camp, as if Mark was accusing her of feeling well while he did not. Harold said, Glenn thinks it might be his appendix. What? Harold only grinned sickly and nodded. Fran got up, walked across to where the others were gathered. Harold trailed her like an unhappy shadow. We've got to help him, Perrin said. She spoke mechanically, as if she had said it many times before. Her eyes went from one of them to the next restlessly, eyes so full of terror and helplessness that Franny once again felt accused. Her thoughts went selfishly to the baby she was carrying, and she tried to push thoughts away. Inappropriate or not, they wouldn't go. Get away from him, part of her screamed at the rest of her. You get away from him right now, he might be catching. She looked at Glenn, who was pale and old-looking in a steady glow of the Coleman lantern. Harold says, you think it's his appendix, she asked. I don't know, Glenn said, sounding upset and scared. He's got the symptoms, certainly. He's feverish. His belly is hard and swelled, painful to the touch. We've got to help him, Perrin said again, and burst into tears. Glenn touched Mark's belly, and Mark's eyes, which had been half-lidded and glazed, opened wide. He screamed. Glenn jerked his hand away, as if he had put it on a hot stove, and looked from Stu to Harold and then back to Stu again, with barely concealed panic. What would you two gentlemen suggest? Harold stood with his throat working convulsively, as if something was stuck there and choking him. At last he blurted, Give him some aspirin. Perrin, who had been gazing down at Mark through her tears, now whirled to look at Harold. Aspirin? She asked. Her tone was one of furious astonishment. Aspirin? This time she shrieked it. Is that the best you can do? With all your big talk smartassery? Aspirin? Harold stuffed his hands into his pockets and looked at her miserably, accepting the rebuke. Stu said very quietly, but Harold's right, Perrin. For now, aspirin's just the best we could do. What time is it? You don't know what to do, she screamed at them. Why don't you just admit it? It's 2:45, Franny said. What if he dies? Perrin pushed a sheaf of dark auburn hair away from her face, which was puffed from crying. Leave them alone, Perry, Mark said in a dull, tired voice. It startled them all. They'll do what they can. If it goes on hurting as bad as this, I think I'd rather be dead anyway. Give me some aspirin. Anything. I'll get it, Harold said, eager to get away. There's some in my knapsack. Extra-strength Excedrin, he said. He added, as if hoping for their approval, and then he went for it, nearly scuttling in his hurry. We've got to help him, Perrin said, returning to her old scripture. Stu drew Glenn and Franny off to one side. Any ideas on what to do about this? He asked them quietly. I don't have any. I can tell you. She was mad at Harold, but his aspirin idea was just about twice as good as any I've had. She's upset, that's all, Fran said. Glenn sighed. Maybe it's just his bowels, too much roughage. Maybe he'll have a good movement and it'll clear up. Franny was shaking her head. I don't think that's it. He wouldn't be running a fever if it was his bowels. And I don't think his belly would be swelled up that way either. It had looked as if a tumor had swelled up there overnight. It made her feel ill to think about. She could not remember when, except for when she was dreaming the dreams. She had been so badly frightened. What was it Harold had said? There's no doctors in the house? How true it was. How horribly true. God, it was all coming to her at once, crashing down all around her. How horribly alone they were. How horribly far out on the wire they were. And somebody had forgotten the safety net. She looked from Glenn's strained face to Stu's. She saw deep concern in both of them, but no answers in either of them. Behind them, Mark screamed again, and Parian echoed his cry, as if she felt his pain. In a way, Franny supposed that she did. What are we going to do? Franny asked helplessly. She was thinking of the baby, and over again the question which dined its way into her mind was, what if it has to be cesarean? What if it has to be cesarean? What if... Behind her, Mark screamed again, like some horrible prophet, and she hated him. They looked at each other in the trembling dark. From Fran Goldsmith's diary, July 6, 1990. After some persuasion, Mr. Bateman had agreed to come along with us. He says that after all of his articles, I write them in big words so no one will really know how simple-minded they are, he says, and boring 20 years of students to death in SY1 and SY2, not to mention the sociology of deviant behavior and rural sociology, he has decided he can't afford to turn down this opportunity. Stu wanted to know what opportunity he meant. I should think that would be clear, says Harold, in that insufferably snotty way of his. Sometimes Harold can be a dear, but he can also be a real booger snot. And tonight, he was being the latter. Mr. Bateman, please call me Glenn, says he, very quietly, but the way Harold glared at him, you would have thought he accused Harold of having some social disease. Glenn, as a sociologist, sees the opportunity to study the formation of society firsthand, I believe. He wants to see how fact compares with theory. Well, to make a long story short, Glenn, which I will call him from now on, says that's what he likes. Agreed. That was mostly it, but added, I also have certain theories which I've written down and hope to prove or disprove. I don't believe that men arising from the ashes of the superflu is going to be anything like men arising from the cradle of the Nile with a bone in his nose, or a woman by the hair. That's one of the theories, Stu said in his quiet way he has, because everything is lying around, waiting to be picked up again. He looked so grim when he said it, like I was surprised, and even Harold looked at him sort of funny. But Glenn just nodded and said, that's right, the Technological Society has walked off the court, so to speak, but they've left all the basketballs behind. Someone will come along who remembers the game and teach it to the rest again. That's rather neat, isn't it? I ought to write it down later. But I've written it down myself, just in case he forgets. Who knows? The shadow do. Hee. So then Harold says, you sound as if you believe the whole thing will start up again. The arms race, the pollution, and so on. Is that another of your theories? Or a corollary to the first one? Not exactly, Glenn started to say. But before he could go any further, Harold burst in with his own chicken bone to pick. I can't put it down word for word, because when he gets excited, Harold talks fast, but what he amounted to, how, even though he had a pretty low opinion of people in general, he didn't think that they could be that stupid. He said he thought that this time around certain laws would be made. One would be no fiddling around with badass stuff like nuclear fission and fluorocarbon. Probably spelled that one wrong, oh well. Sprays and stuff like that. I do remember one thing he said, because it was a very vivid image. Just because the Gordian knot has been cut for us is no reason for us to go to work and tie it back up. I could see he was just spoiling for an argument. One of the things that makes Harold hard to like is how eager he is to show off how much he knows. And he sure does know a lot. I can take That I can't take that away from him. Harold is super bright. But all Glenn said was, "Time will tell, won't it?" That all finished up about an hour ago, and now I'm in an upstairs bed and bedroom with Kojak lying on the floor beside me. Good dog. It is all rather cozy, reminds me of home. But I'm trying to think about home too much. I'm trying not to think about home too much because it makes me weepy. I know this must sound awful, but I really wish I had someone to help me warm this bed. I even have a candidate in mind. Put it out of your mind, Franny. So tomorrow we're off to Stovington, and I know Stu doesn't like that idea much. He's scared of that place. I like Stu very much, only wish Harold liked him more. Harold is making everything very hard, but I suppose he can't help his nature. Glenn has decided to leave Kojak behind. He is sorry to have to do that, even though Kojak will have no trouble finding forage. Still, there is nothing else for it unless we can find a motorcycle with a sidecar, and even then poor Kojak might get scared and jump out, hurt, or kill himself. Anyway, tomorrow we'll be going. Things to remember. The Texas Rangers baseball team had a pitcher named Nolan Ryan who pitched all kinds of no-hitters and things with his famous fastball. And no-hitter is very good. There are TV comedies with laugh tracks, and the laugh track was people on tape laughing at the funny parts, and they were supposed to make you have a better time watching. You used to be able to get frozen cakes and pies at the supermarket and just saw them out and eat them. Sara Lee strawberry cheesecake was my personal favorite. July 7th, 1990. Can't write long. Cycled all day. My fanny feels like hamburger and my back feels like there's a rock in it. I had that bad dream again last night. Harold has also been dreaming about that man, and it upsets the hell out of him because he can't explain how both of us can be having what is essentially the same dream. Stu says he's still having that dream about Nebraska and the old black woman there. She keeps saying he could come and see her any time. Stu thinks she lives in a town called Holland Home or Hometown or something like that. Says he thinks he can find it. Harold sneered at him and went into a long spiel about how dreams were psycho-Freudian manifestations of things we didn't dare think about when we were awake. Stu was angry, I think, but he kept his temper. I'm so afraid that the bad feeling between them may break out into the open. I wish it didn't have to be this way. Anyway, Stu said, "So how come you and Franny are having the same dream?" Harold muttered something about coincidence and just stalked off. Stu told Glenn and I that he would like to go to Nebraska after Stovington. Glenn shrugged and said, "Why not? We have to go somewhere." Harold, of course, will object on general principles. Damn you, Harold, grow up. Things to remember. Were gasoline shortages in the early 80s because everybody in America was driving something, and we had used up most of our oil supplies, and the Arabs had us by the short hairs. The Arabs had so much money they literally couldn't spend it. There was a rock and roll group called The Who that sometimes used to finish their live performances by smashing their guitars and amplifiers. This was known as conspicuous consumption. July 8th, 1990. It's late and I'm tired again. I should try and get as much down as I possibly can before my eyelids just slam shut. Harold finished his sign about an hour ago, with much bad grace, I must say, and put it on the front lawn of the Stovington installation. Stu helped him put it up and held his peace in spite of all Harold's mean little jibes. I had tried to prepare myself for the disappointment. I never believed Stu was lying, and I really don't think Harold believed he was either. So I was sure everybody was dead, but still it was an upsetting experience, and I cried. I couldn't help myself. But I wasn't the only one who was upset when Stu saw the place turned almost dead white. He had on a short-sleeved shirt, and I could see he had goosebumps all up and down his arms. His eyes are normally blue, but they had gone a slaty gray, like the ocean on a gray day. He pointed up on the third floor and said that was my room. Harold turned toward him, and I could see getting ready with one of his patented Harold Lauder smartass comments. But then he saw Stu's face and shut up. I think that was very wise of him, actually. So after a little while, Harold says, well, let's go in and look around. What would you want to do that for? Stu answers. And he sounded almost hysterical, but keeping it under a tight rein. It scared me. More so because he was usually as cool as ice water. Witness what little success Harold has had getting under his skin. Stuart, Glenn starts, but Stu interrupts with, what for? Can't you see it's a dead place? No brass bands, no soldiers, no nothing. Believe it, he says. If they were here, they'd be all over us by now. We'd be up in those white rooms like a bunch of fucking guinea pigs. Then he looks at me and says, sorry, Fran. I didn't mean to talk that way. I guess I'm upset. Well, I'm going in, Harold says. Who's coming with me? But I could see that even though Harold was trying to be big and bold, he was really scared himself. Glenn said he would, and Stu said, you go in too, Fran. Have a look. Satisfy yourself. I wanted to say I'd stay outside with him because he looked so uptight and because I really didn't want to go in either, you know. But that would have made more trouble with Harold. So I said, okay. If we, Glenn and I, had really had any doubts about Stu's story, we could have dropped them as soon as we opened the door. It was the smell. You could smell the same thing in any of the fair-sized towns we've traveled through. To smell like decayed tomatoes. Oh, God, I'm crying again. Is it right for people not just to die, but then to stink like... Wait. Later. There, I've had my second good cry of the day. Whatever can be happening. Little Fran Goldsmith, our gal Sal, who used to be able to chew up nails and spit out carpet tacks, was as the old saying goes. Well, no more tears tonight, and that's a promise. We went inside anyway. Morbid curiosity, I guess. I don't know about the others, but I kind of wanted to see the room where Stu was held prisoner. Anyway, it wasn't just the smell, you know, but how cool the place was after the outside. A lot of granite and marble and probably really fantastic insulation. It was warmer on the top two floors, but down below was that smell and the cool. It was like a tomb. Yuck. It was also spooky, like a haunted house. The three of us were all huddled together like sheep, and I was glad I had my rifle, even if it is only a .22. Our footsteps kept echoing back to us as if someone was creeping along, following us, you know. And I started thinking about that dream again. The one starring the man in the black robe. I wonder Stu didn't want to come with us. We wandered around to the elevators at last and went up to the second floor. Nothing there but offices, several bodies. The third floor was made up like a hospital, but all the rooms had airlock doors. Both Harold and Glenn said that's what they were. Special viewing windows. There were lots of bodies up there, in the rooms and in the hallways too. Very few women. Did they try to evacuate them at the end? I wonder. There's so much we'll never know, but then, why would we want to? Anyway, at the end of the hall, leading down to the main corridor, where the elevator core was, we found a room with its airlock door open. There was a dead man in there. But he wasn't a patient. They were all wearing white hospital johnnies. And he sure didn't die of the flu. He was lying in a big pool of dried blood, and he looked like he'd been trying to crawl out of the room when he died. There was a broken chair, and things were all messed up, as if there'd been a fight. Glenn looked around for a long time and then said, I don't think we'd better say anything about this room to Stu. I believe he came very close to dying in here. I looked at that sprawled body and felt creepier than ever. What do you mean? Harold asked. And even he sounded hushed. It was one of those few times I ever heard Harold talk as if what he was saying wasn't going out on the public address system. I believe that gentleman here came in here to kill Stuart, Glenn said, and that Stuart somehow got the better of him. But why? I asked. Why would they want to kill Stu if he was immune? It doesn't make any sense. He looked at me, and his eyes were scary. His eyes looked almost dead, like a mackerel's eyes. That doesn't matter, Fran, he said. Sense didn't have much to do with this place, from the way it looks. There's a certain mentality that believes in covering up. They believe in it with a sincerity and fanatism that members of some religious groups believe in the divinity of Jesus. Because for some people, the necessity to continue covering up even after the damage is done is all important. It makes me wonder how many immunes they killed in Atlanta and San Francisco and Topeka Viral Center before the plague finally killed them and made an end to their butchery. This asshole, I'm glad he's dead. I'm only sorry for Stu. He'll probably spend the rest of his life having nightmares about him. And do you know what Glenn Bateman did then? The nice man who paints the horrible pictures? He went over and kicked that dead man in his face. Harold made a muffled sort of grunt, as if he had been the one who had been kicked. Then Glenn drew his foot back again. No, Harold yells. But Glenn kicked the dead man again, just the same. Then he turned around, and he was wiping his mouth with his back of his hand. But at least his eyes had lost that awful dead fish look. Come on, he says. Let's get out of here. Stu was right. It's a dead place. So we went out, and Stu was sitting with his back to the iron gate and the high wall that ran around the place. And I wanted to... Oh, go ahead, Franny. If you can't tell your diary, who can you tell? I wanted to run to him and kiss him and tell him I was ashamed for all of us not believing him, and ashamed of how all of us had gone on about what a hard time we'd had when the plague was on, and him hardly saying anything when all the time that man had almost killed him. Oh dear, I'm falling in love with him, I think. I've got the world's most crushable crush. If only it wasn't for Harold, I'd take my damn chances. Anyway, there's always an anyway. Even though by now my fingers are so numb they are just about falling off. That was when Stu told us for the first time that he wanted to go to Nebraska, that he wanted to check out his dream. He had a stubborn, sort of embarrassed look on his face, as if he knew he was going to have to take some more patronizing shit from Harold, but Harold was too unnerved from our tour of Stovington facility to offer more than a token resistance. And even that stopped when Glenn said, in a very reticent way, that he had also dreamed of the old woman the night before. Of course, it might only be because Stu told us about his dream, he said, kind of red in the face, but it was remarkably similar. Harold said, of course it was that. But Stu said, wait a minute, Harold, I've got an idea. His idea was that we all take a sheet of paper and write down everything we could remember of our dreams over the last week, then compare notes. This was just scientific enough so that Harold couldn't grumble too much. Well, the only dream I've had is the one I've written down, and I won't repeat it. I'll just say I wrote it down, leaving the part about my father, but leaving out the part about the baby in the coat hanger he always has. The results, when we compared our papers, was rather amazing. Harold, Stu, and I had all dreamed about the Dark Man, as I call him. Both Stu and I visualized him as a man in a monk's cloak with no visible features. His face is always in the shadow. Harold's paper said that he was always standing in a dark doorway, beckoning to him like a pimp. Sometimes he could just see his feet and the shine of his eyes, like weasel's eyes, is how he put it. Stu and Glenn's dreams of the old woman were very similar. The points of similarity were almost too many to go into, which is my literary way of saying my fingers are going numb. Anyway, they both agreed she is in Polk County, Nebraska, although they couldn't get together on the actual name of the town. Stu says Hollingford home, Glenn says Hemingway home, close either way. They both seemed to feel they could find it. Note well, diary. My guess is Hemmingford home. She's right. Glenn said, this is very remarkable. We all seem to be sharing an authentic psychic experience. Harold pooh-poohed, of course, but he looked like he'd been given lots of food for thought. He would only agree to go on the basis of, we have to go somewhere. We leave in the morning. I'm scared, excited, and mostly happy to be leaving Stovington, which is a death place. And I'll take the old woman over the dark man any time. Things to remember. Hang loose means don't get upset. Rad and gnarly were ways of saying a thing was good. No sweat meant you weren't worried. To boogie down was to have a good time. And lots of people wore t-shirts which said shit happens, which it certainly did, and still does. I got grease was a pretty current expression. I first heard it just this year. That meant everything was going well. Digs, as an old British expression, was just replacing pad or crash pad as an expression for the place you were living in before the superflu hit. It was very cool to say, I dig your digs. Stupid, huh? But that was life. It was just after 12 noon. Marianne had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside Mark, who they had moved carefully into the shade 2 hours earlier. He was in and out of consciousness, and it was easier on all of them when he was out. 1 second. Oh, I did close the gate. Okay. He had held against the pain for the remainder of the night, but after daybreak he had finally given in to it, and when he was conscious his screams curdled their blood. They stood looking at each other, helpless. No one had wanted any lunch. It's his appendix, Glenn said. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Let's see, how much further we got? Oh, we're almost done. Maybe we ought to try, operating on him, Harold said. He was looking at Glenn. I don't suppose you... We'd kill him, Glenn said flatly. You know that, Harold. If we could open him up without having him bleed to death, which we couldn't, we wouldn't know his appendix from his pancreas. The stuff in there isn't labeled, you know. We'll kill him if we don't, Harold said. Do you want to try? Glenn asked waspishly. Sometimes I wonder about you, Harold. Well, I don't see that you're being much help in our current situation either, Harold said, flushing. No, stop. Come on, Stu said. What good are either of you doing? Unless one of you plans to saw him open with a jackknife. It's out of the question anyway. Stu! Franny almost gasped. Well, he said, and shrugged. The nearest hospital would be back in Mommy. We would never get him there. I don't even think we could get him back to the turnpike. You're right, of course, Glenn muttered, and ran a hand over his sandpapery cheek. Harold, I apologize. I'm very upset. I know this sort of thing could happen. Would happen. But I guess I only knew it in an academic way. Good Lord. This is a lot different than sitting in the old study, blue skying things. Harold muttered an ungrateful acknowledgment and walked off with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. He looked like a stalky, overgrown 10-year-old. Why can't we move him? Fran said desperately, looking from Stu to Glenn. Because of how much his appendix might have swelled by now, Glenn said. If it bursts, it's going to dump enough poison into his system to kill 10 men. Stu nodded. Peritonitis. Franny's head whirled. Appendicitis. That was nothing these days. Nothing. Why, sometimes, if you were in the hospital with gallstones or something, they would just lift out your appendix on general principles while they had you open. She remembered that one of her grammar school friends, a boy named Charlie Biggers, whom everyone had called Biggie, had had his appendix out during the summer between 5th and 6th grades. He was only in the hospital for 2 or 3 days. Having your appendix out was just nothing, medically speaking. Just like having a baby was nothing, medically speaking. But if you leave him alone, she asked, won't it burst anyway? Stu and Glenn looked at each other uncomfortably and said nothing. Then, you're just as bad as Harold says, she burst out wildly. You've got to do something, even if it is with a jackknife. You've got to. Why us? Glenn asked angrily. Why not you? We don't even have a medical book, for Christ's sake. But he, it can't happen this way. Having your appendix out is supposed to be nothing. Well, maybe not in the old days, but it's sure something now, Glenn said. But by then she had blundered off crying. She came back around 3 o'clock ashamed of herself and ready to apologize, but neither Glenn nor Stu was in the camp. Harold was sitting dejectedly on a trunk of a fallen tree. Marion was sitting cross-legged by Mark, sponging his face with the cloth. She looked pale, but composed. Yeah, composed. Franny, Harold said, looking up and brightening visibly. Hi, Harold. She went on to Perrin. How is he? Sleeping, Perrin said. But he wasn't sleeping. Even Fran could see that. He was unconscious. Where have the others gone, Perry? Do you know? It was Harold who answered her. He had come up behind her, and Fran could feel him wanting to touch her hair or put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't want him to. Harold had begun to make her acutely uncomfortable almost all of the time. They've gone to Kunkel to look for a doctor's office. They thought they could get some books, Perry said, and some instruments. She swallowed and her throat made an audible click. She went on cooling Mark's face, occasionally dipping her cloth into one of the canteens and wringing it out. We're really sorry, Harold said uncomfortably. I guess it doesn't sound like jack shit, but we really are. Harry looked up and offered Harold a strange, sweet smile. I know that, she said. Thank you. This is no one's fault. Unless there's a God, of course. If there's a God, then it's his fault. And when I see him, I'm going to kick him in the balls. She had a horsey sort of face and a thin peasant's body. A thick peasant's body. Fran, who saw everyone's best features long before she saw the less fortunate ones, Harold, for instance, had a lovely pair of hands for a boy, noticed that Perry's hair, a soft auburn shade, was almost gorgeous, and that her dark indigo eyes were fine and intelligent. She had taught anthropology at NYU, she had told them, and she had also been active as a member of political causes, including women's rights and equal treatment under the law for AIDS victims. She had never been married. Mark, she told Franny once, had been better to her than she had expected a man to be. The others she had known had either ignored her or lumped her with other girls as a pig or a skag. She admitted Mark might have been might have been in a group which had always just ignored her if conditions had been normal, but they hadn't been. They met each other in Albany, where Perrin had been summering with her parents, on the last day of June, and after some talk, they decided to get out of the city before all the germs incubating and all the decomposing bodies could do to them what the superflu hadn't been able to do. So they had left, and the next night they had become lovers, more out of desperate loneliness than any real attraction. This was girl talk, and Franny hadn't even written it down in her diary. He was good to her. Harry had told Fran in the soft and slightly amazed way of all plain women who had discovered a nice man in a hard world. She began to love him a little more each day. She had begun to love him. And now this. It's funny, she said. Everyone here but Stu and Harold are college graduates. And you certainly would have been if things had gone on in their normal course, Harold. Yes, I guess that's true, Harold said. Harry turned back to Mark and began to sponge his forehead again, gently with love. Franny was reminded of the color plate in her family Bible, a picture that showed 3 women making the body of Jesus ready for burial. They were anointing him with oils and spices. Franny was studying English. Glenn was a teacher of sociology. Mark was getting his doctorate in American history, Harold. You'd be in English, too, wanting to be a writer. We could sit around and have some wonderful bull sessions. We did, as a matter of fact, didn't we? Yes, Harold agreed. His voice, normally penetrating, was almost too low to hear. A liberal arts education teaches you how to think. I read that somewhere. The hard facts you learn are secondary to that. The big thing you take away from school with you is how to induct and deduct in a constructive way. That's good, Harold said. I like that. Now his hands did drop on Franny's shoulder. She didn't shrug it away, but she was unhappily conscious of its presence. But it isn't good, Perry said fiercely, and in his surprise, Harold took his hand off Franny's shoulder. She felt lighter immediately. No? He asked, rather timidly. He's dying, Perry said. Not loudly, but in an angry, helpless way. He's dying because we've all been spending our time learning how to bullshit each other in dorms and the living rooms of cheap apartments in college towns. Oh, I could tell you about the Midi Indians of North Guinea, and Harold could explain the literary technique of the later English poets. But what good does that do of any of that? What good does any of that do, Mark? My Mark. If we had somebody from med school, Fran began tentatively. Yes, if we did, but we don't. We don't even have a car mechanic with us, or someone who went to ag college and might have at least watched once when a vet was working on a cow or a horse. She looked at them, her indigo eyes growing even darker. Much as I like you all, I think at this point I'd trade the whole bunch of you for Mr. Goodwrench. You're all so afraid to touch him, even though you know what's going to happen if you don't. And I'm the same way. I'm not excluding myself. At least the two, Franny stopped. She had been about to say, at least the two men went, then decided that might be unfortunate phrasing, with Harold still here. At least Stu and Glenn went. That's something, isn't it? Harry said, yes, that's something. But it was Stu's decision to go, wasn't it? The only one of us who'd finally decided it would be better to go try anything than to just stand around wringing our hands. She looked at Franny. Did he tell you what he did for a living before? He worked in a factory, Fran said promptly. She did not notice that Harold's brow clouded at how quickly she was able to come up with this information. He put circuits in electrical calculators. I guess you could say he was a computer technician. Ha! Harold said and smiled sourly. He's the only one of us who understands taking things apart, Perry said. What he and Mr. Bateman do will kill Mark. I'm almost sure it will. But it's better that he be killed while somebody is trying to make him well than it would be for him to die while we just stand around watching, as if he was a dog that had been run over in the street. Neither Harold nor Fran could find a reply to that. They only stood behind her and watched Mark's pale, still face. After a while, Harold put his sweaty hand on Fran's shoulder again and made her feel like screaming. Stu and Glenn got back at 3:45. They had taken one of the cycles. Tied behind it was a doctor's black bag of instruments, and several large black books. We'll try, was all Stu said. Perry looked up. Her face was white and strained, her voice calm. Would you please? We both want you to, she said. Stu, Perry said. It was just past 4. Stu was kneeling with a rubber sheet on a rubber sheet that had been spread under the tree. Sweat was pouring from his face in rivers. His eyes looked bright and haunted and frantic. Franny was holding a book open in front of him, switching back and forth between 2 color plates whenever Stu raised his eyes and nodded at her. Beside him, horribly white, Glenn Bateman held a spool of fine white thread. Between them was an open case of stainless steel instruments. The case was now splashed with blood. It's here, Stu cried. His voice was suddenly high and hard and exalted. His eyes had narrowed to 2 points. Here's the little bastard, here, right here. Stu, Perry said. Fran, show me the other plate again. Quick, quick. Can you take it out? Glenn asked. Jesus, these testers, do you really think you can? Harold was gone. He had left the party early, holding one hand cupped over his mouth. He had been standing in a small grove of trees to the east, his back to them, for at least 15 minutes. Now he turned back, his large round face hopeful. I don't know, Stu said, but I might. I just might. He stared at the color plate Fran was showing him. He was wearing blood up to his elbows, like scarlet evening gloves. Stu, Harry said. It's self-containing above and below, Stu whispered. His eyes glittered fantastically. The appendix. It's in its own little unit. Wipe my forehead, Franny. Jesus, I'm sweating like a fucking pig. Thanks, God. I don't want to cut his doings any worse than I have to. That's his ever fucking intestines. Christ, I gotta stew, Harry said. Give me the scissors, Glenn. No, not those. The small pair. Stew! He looked at her at last. You don't need to. Her voice was calm, soft. He's dead. Stu looked at her, his narrowed eyes slowly widening. She nodded. Almost 2 minutes ago, but thank you. Thank you for trying. Stu looked at her for a long time. You're sure? He whispered at last. She nodded again. Tears were spilling silently down her face. Stu turned away from them, dropping a small scalpel he had been holding. Put his hands over his eyes, in a gesture of utter despair. Glenn had already gotten up and walked off, not looking back, his shoulders hunched, as if from a blow. Around Stu and hugged him. That's that, he said. He said it over and over again, speaking in a slow and toneless way that frightened her. That's that. All over. That's that. That's that. You did the best you could, she said, and hugged him even tighter, as if he might fly away. That's that, he said again, with a dull finality. Franny hugged him. Despite all her thoughts of the last 3.5 weeks, despite her crushable crush, she had not made a single overt move. She had been almost painfully careful not to show the way she felt. Hello? 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 Oh, you're back early. That was fast. That was really fast. You didn't, what, you weren't in there, what, 10 minutes? Dang. Careful not to show the way she felt. The situation with Harold was too much on a hair trigger, and she was not showing the true way she felt about Stu even now. Not really. It was not a lover's hug she was bestowing on him. It was simply one survivor clinging to another. Stu seemed to understand this. His hands came up to her shoulders and pressed them firmly, leaving bloody handprints on her khaki shirt, marking her in a way which seemed to make them partners in some unhappy crime. Somewhere Jay cawed harshly, and the closer at hand Parian began to weep. When you get a chance, can you feed Harley timber, please? Harold Lauder, who did not know the difference between the hugs survivors and lovers may bestow on each other, gazed at Franny and Stu with dawning suspicion and fear. After a long moment, he crashed furiously off into the brush and didn't come back until long after supper. Huh? Yeah. She woke up early the next morning. Someone was shaking her. I'll open my eyes and it'll be Glenn or Harold. She thought sleepily. We're going to go through it again. And we'll keep on going through it until we get it right. Those who do not learn from history. But it was Stu. And it was already daylight of some sort, creeping dawn, muffled in the early mists like fresh gold wrapped in thin cotton. The others were sleeping humps. What is it? She asked, sitting up. Something wrong. I was dreaming again, he said. Not the old woman, the other one, the dark man. I haven't even had any. I was scared, so I... Stop it, she said, frightened by the look in his face. Say what you mean, please. It's period. The Venerol. She got the Venerol out of Glenn's pack. She hissed in breath. Oh boy, Stu said brokenly. She's dead, Franny. Oh Lord, ain't this just some mess? She tried to speak and found she could not. I guess I've got to wake the others up, Stu said, in an absent sort of way. He rubbed he rubbed at his cheek, which was sandpapery with beard. Frank could still remember how it had felt against her own cheek yesterday, when she had hugged him. He turned back to her, bewildered. When does it end? She said softly, I don't think it ever will. Their eyes locked in the early dawn. From Fran Goldsmith's diary, July 12th, 1990. We've camped just west of Guilderland, New York tonight. Have finally made it onto the big highway, Route 8090. The excitement of meeting Mark and Perian. Don't you think that's a pretty name? I do. Yesterday afternoon was more or less abated. They had agreed to throw in with us. In fact, they made the suggestion before any of us could. Not that I'm sure Harold would have offered. You know how he is. And he was a little put off, I think Lynn was too, by all the hardware they were carrying, including semi-automatic rifles, too. But mostly, Harold just had to have his little song and dance. He had to register his presence, you know. I guess I have filled up pages and pages with the psychology of Harold, and if you don't know him by now, you never will. Underneath his swagger and all his pompous pronouncements, there is a very insecure little boy. He can't really believe that things have changed. Part of him, quite the large part, I think, has to go on believing that all his high school tormentors are going to rise up out of the graves one fine day and start shooting spitballs at him again, or maybe calling him whack off Lauder, as Amy said they used to do. Sometimes I think it would have been better for him, and maybe me too, if we hadn't hooked up back in Ogunquit. I'm part of his old life. I was best friends with his sister once upon a time, so on and so on. What sums up my weird relationship with Harold is this, strange as it may seem, knowing what I know now. I would probably pick Harold to be friends with instead of Amy, who was mostly dizzy about boys with nice cars and clothes from Sweeties, and who was, God forgive me for saying cruddy things about the dead, but it's true, the real Ogunquit snob. The way only a year-round townie can be won. Harold is, in his own weird way, some sort of cool, when he's not concentrating on all his mental energies on being an asshole, that is. But you see, Harold could never believe that anyone could think he was cool. Part of him has such a huge investment in being square. He is determined to carry all of his problems right along with him into this not so brave new world. He might as well have them packed right inside his knapsack along with those chocolate payday candy bars he likes to eat. No, Harold, geez, I just don't know. Things to remember. The Gillette parrot, please don't squeeze the Charmin. The walking Kool-Aid pitcher that used to say, oh yeah, OB tampons created by a woman gynecologist. Converse All-Stars, Night of the Living Dead. That last one hits too close to home. I quit. July 14th, 1990. We had a very long and sober talk about the dreams today at lunch, stopping much longer than we should have, probably. We're just north of Batavia, New York, by the way. Yesterday, Harold, very diffidently for him, suggested we start stocking up on Venerol and hitting ourselves with very light doses to see if we couldn't disrupt the dream cycle, as he put it. I went along with the idea so no one would start to wonder if something might be wrong with me. But I plan to palm my dose because I don't know what it might do to the Lone Ranger. I hope he's lone. I'm not sure I could face twins. With the Venerol proposal adopted, Mark had a comment. You know, he says, things like this really don't bear too much thinking about. The next thing you know, we'll all be thinking about Moses and Joseph getting telephone calls from God. That dark man isn't calling from heaven, Stu says. If it's a toll call, I think he's coming from someplace a lot lower down. Which is Stu's way of saying Old Scratch is after us, Granny pipes up. And that's as good an explanation as any other, Glenn says. We all look at him. Well, he went on, a little on the defensive, I think. If you look at it from a theological point of view, it does rather seem as if we're the knot in a tug-of-war rope between heaven and hell, doesn't it? If there are any Jesuit survivors of the superflu, they must be going absolute bananas. That made Mark laugh his head off. I didn't really get it, but kept my mouth shut. Well, I think the whole thing is ridiculous, Harold put it. You'll be getting around to Edgar Casey and the transmigration of souls before we know it. He pronounced Casey as Case, and when I corrected him, you say it like the initials for Kansas City, KC. He gave me a rather horrid Harold frown. He isn't the type of guy who swamps you with gratitude when you point out his little flaws, diary. Whenever something overtly paranormal occurs, Glenn said, the only explanation that really fits well and holds its interior logic is the theological one. That's why psychics and religion have always gone hand in hand, right up to your modern-day faith healers. Harold was grumbling, but Glenn went on anyway. My own gut feeling is that everyone's psychic, and it's so ingrained a part of us that we very rarely notice it. The talent may be very preventative, largely preventative, and that keeps it from being noticed too. Why, I asked. Because it's a negative factor, Fran. Have any of you ever read James D.L. Staunton's 1958 study of train and airplane crashes? It was originally published in the Sociology Journal, but the tabloid newspapers break it up every now and again. We all shook our heads. You ought to, he said. James Staunton was what my students of 20 years ago would have called a real good head, a mild-mannered clinical sociologist who studied the occult as a kind of hobby. He wrote any number of articles on the combined subjects before going over to the other side to do some first-hand research. Harold snorted, but Stu and Mark were grinning. I fear I was too. So, tell us about the planes and trains, Perry says. Well, Staunton got the stats on over 50 plane crashes since 1925 and over 200 train crashes since 1900. He fed all the data into a computer. Basically, he was correlating three factors: those present on any such conveyance that met with disaster, those killed, and the capacity of the vehicle. Don't see what he was trying to prove, Stu said. To see that, you have to understand that he fed a second series of figures into the computer, this time an equal number of planes and trains which didn't meet the disaster. Mark nodded. A control group and an experimental group. That seemed solid enough. What he found was simple enough, but staggering in its implications. It's a shame one has to stagger through 16 tables to get at the underlying statistical fact. What fact? I asked. Full planes and trains rarely crash, Glenn said. Oh, fucking bullshit, Harold just about screams. Not at all, Glenn says calmly. That was Staunton's theory, and the computer bore him out. In cases where planes or trains crash, the vehicles are running at 61% capacity as regards passenger loads. In cases where they don't, the vehicles are running 76% capacity. That's a difference of over 15%, a large computer run. And that sort of across-the-board deviation is significant. Staunton points out that, statistically speaking, a 3% deviation would be food for thought. And he's right. It's an anomaly the size of Texas. Staunton's deduction was that people know when planes and trains are going to crash, that they are unconsciously predicting the future. Your Aunt Sally gets a bad stomachache just before Flight 61 takes off from Chicago, bound for San Diego. And then the plane crashes in the Nevada desert. Everyone says, "Oh, Aunt Sally, that bellyache was really the grace of God." But until James Staunton came along, no one had that there were really 30 people with belly aches or headaches, or just that funny feeling you get in your legs when your body is trying to tell your head that something is getting ready to go way off course. I just can't believe that, Harold says, shaking his head rather woefully. Well, Glenn said, about a week after I finished the Staunton article, for the very first time, a Majestic Airlines jet crashed at Logan Airport. It killed everyone on board. Well, I called the Majestic office at Logan after things have settled down a bit. I told him I was a reporter from the Manchester Union Leader, a small lie with in a good cause. I said we were getting a sidebar on airline crashes together and asked if they could tell me how many no-shows there were on the flight. The man sounded kind of surprised, but because he said the airline personnel had been talking about that. The number was 16. 16 no-shows. I asked him what the average on the 747 flights from Denver to Boston, and he said it was 3. 3, Parian said in a marveling kind of way. Right. But the guy went further. He said they also had 15 cancellations. The average number is 8. So although the headlines after the fact screamed Logan Air crash kills 94, it could just as well have read 31 avoid death in Logan Airport disaster. Well, there was a lot of talk about psychic stuff, but it wandered pretty far afield from the subject of our dreams and whether or not they come from the big righteous in the sky. One thing that did come up, this was after Harold had wandered away in utter disgust, was Stu asking Glenn if we're also psychic, then how come we don't know when a loved one has just died or that our house just blew up in a tornado or something? There are cases exactly that sort of thing, Glenn said. But I will admit, they are nowhere near as common or as easy to prove with the aid of a computer. It's an interesting point. I have a theory. Doesn't he always, diary? That has to do with evolution. Once men or their progenitors had tails and hair all over their bodies and much sharper senses than they do now. Why don't we have them anymore? Quick, Stu. This is your chance to go to the head of the class, mortarboard and all. Why, for the same reason people don't wear goggles and dusters when they drive it. Yes, sometimes you outgrow a thing. It gets to the point where you don't need it anymore. Exactly. And what is the point of having a psychic sense that's useless in any practical way? What earthly good would it do you to be working in the office and suddenly know that your wife has been killed in a car smash coming back from the market? Someone is going to call you on the telephone and tell you, right? That sense may have atrophied long ago, if we ever had it. It may have gone the way of our tails and our pelts. What interests me about these dreams, he went on, is that they seem to presage some future struggle. We seem to be getting cloudy pictures of a protagonist and an antagonist, an adversary, if you like. If that's so, it may be like looking at a plane on which you're scheduled to fly and getting a bellyache. We're being given the means to help shape our own futures, perhaps. A kind of fourth dimensional free will, the chance to choose in advance of events. But we don't know what the dreams mean, I said. No, we don't. But we may. I don't know if the little tickle of psychic ability means we are divine. There are plenty of people who can accept the miracle of eyesight without believing that eyesight proves the existence of God. And I am one of them. But I do believe these dreams are a constructive force in spite of their ability to frighten us. I'm having second thoughts about the veneral as a result. Taking it is very much like swallowing some Pepto-Bismol to quiet a bellyache, and then getting on the plane anyway. Things to remember. Recessions, shortages, the prototype Ford Growler that could go 60 miles of highway on a single gallon of gas. What the heck is a Ford Growler? Oh, thing of it is, I don't know, maybe cars have changed since the 80s. It's a 1982 car. 60 miles of highway on a single gallon of gas. And if you think about it, we can now go, what, almost 300 on a gallon of gas? Long way. Quite the wonder car. That's all. I quit. If I don't shorten my entries, this diary will be as long as Gone with the Wind, long before the Lone Ranger arrives. Although, please, not on a white horse named Silver. Oh, yes, one other thing to remember. Edgar Casey. Can't forget him. He supposedly saw the future in his dreams. July 16th, 1990. Only two notes, both of them relating to the dreams. See entry 2 days ago. Yeah, that was... Actually, it was 4 days ago, but... First, Glenn Bateman had been very pale and silent these last 2 days, and tonight I saw him take an extra large dose of Veneral. Wow, Veneral. My suspicion is that he skipped the last 2 doses, and the result has some very bad dreams. This worries me. I wish I knew a way to approach him about it, but can think of nothing. Second to my own dreams. Nothing night before last. The night after our discussion. Slept like a baby and can't remember a thing. Last night I dreamed of the old woman for the first time. Had nothing to add beyond what has already been said, except to say she seems to exude an aura of niceness, of kindness. I think I can understand why Stu was so set on going to Nebraska, even in the face of Harold's sarcasm. I woke up this morning completely refreshed, thinking that if we could just get to that old woman, Mother Abigail, everything would be A-okay. I hope she's really there. By the way, I'm quite sure that the name of the town is Hemmingford Home. Things to remember, Mother Abigail. And that is where we are going to stop. Oh, there was one for the 14th. So yeah, 2 days ago would be the last entry. All right. Now, tonight we are going to start up with 48, that second half of 48, and we're going to finish that one. So now that we have 46 reread, I'm going to make that up so that I don't delete it by accident tonight. I don't know how I did it. I mean, I know how I did it, but it still upsets me that I did it. Second time I've done it. I had to do it to something else, and I can't remember what it was. I'll look in my journal and find out. But anyway, I'm going to write that we redid 46 here, so that I know. There we go. So, yesterday morning was that sound. Anyway, I'm going to let y'all go. I will see you tonight, probably around 7 o'clock. So, have a good day. And remember, tomorrow morning, and I will remind you again tonight, tomorrow morning there will be no reading, and I'm not sure about Thursday evening because it is Thanksgiving here in the U.S. So, I'm going to spend it with family. Y'all have a good night, good day, whichever it is for you. And we shall see you again soon. All right? Love y'all. Follow if you haven't. That way you can keep up with when we're going to read. And I will talk to y'all soon. Bye.